Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of this new seminar that we're doing at the New Center called The Pathos of Modernity with instructor Nathan Brown. In the wake of Kant's epochal intervention in the history of philosophy and amid the tumultuous aftermath of the French Revolution, a generation of German philosophers and poets took up the task of rethinking knowledge of the absolute, the problem of freedom, the methodology of dialectical reasoning, the concept of the tragic, and above all, the significance of modernity. The work of Friedrich Hölderlin is central to this pivotal moment in German literature and philosophy in the late 18th and early 19th century. This seminar will focus on Hölderlin's late elegies and hymns, approaching these in light of Hölderlin's poetological writings and his reception by important 20th century thinkers such as Heidegger, Adorno, Nancy, Hammacher, and Hendrik. We will pay close attention to the formal, conceptual, rhetorical, and tonal particulars of the poem, and we will situate this amid the pathos of modernity, the complex feeling of the movement of history as its wrenching transformations traverse modern literature and philosophy. Nathan Brown is professor of English and founding director of the Center for Expanded Poetics at Concordia University, Montreal. He's the author of Rationalist Empiricism, a Theory of Speculative Critique, in Fordham 2021, The Limits of Fabrication, Material Science, Materialist Poetics, also in Fordham and in 2017, and Baudelaire's Shadow on Poetic Determination, forthcoming. His translation of Baudelaire's The Flower of Evil was published by Verso in 2025. I hand it over to you, Nathan.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. And thanks to everyone who's in the group right now for coming. I know that there are many choices among the New Center seminars, and I know that everyone these days is undoubtedly pressed for time, so I don't take it for granted that you're interested in taking this seminar with me, learning something about Friedrich Hölderlin, and thinking through what I'm calling the pathos of modernity. So I really appreciate your attendance and your participation. I'll say a few things by way of introduction before we plunge into our main text for this week, which is Bread and Wine. It'll be a little bit unusual this week because I'm going to start out with some general remarks on Hölderlin and on what I mean by the pathos of modernity. And then eventually we'll get to our main text, which is Bread and Wine. Normally in the seminar, we'll sort of start right in with a lecture on the main poem for each week. So that's my plan going forward. This week is a little bit different. And for that reason, I might have a little more to say also by way of introduction this week. But let me just say that the general format of the seminar will be that first, I'll give a lecture. That will normally be around, let's say, 50 to 60 minutes. And that will be focused on our primary text each week. And then second, we'll have a Q&A, so questions about the lecture. And that will normally be, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll take a brief break, and then we'll follow up with open discussion for about the last hour or so of the seminar. And we'll come back to some questions about the format and the syllabus and the assignments for those of you who are certificate students toward the end of the session today, because we want to plunge in to the materials. The syllabus is available online. Each week, I'll also put a video recording of a reading of the main poem for the week up online, which I've just done about an hour ago today. So that might be a way to sort of refresh your memory and go through the poem just before the seminar session if you want to. But without further ado, I'll plunge in. So the pathos of modernity. What I mean by this is that our topic is the way in which poetry, specifically, registers the contradictions of modernity at a particular place and time. So that is to say, in the case of Friedrich Hölderlin's work, Germany in the last decade of the 18th century and the first decade of the 19th century. That will be the period of Holderlin's career that we're particularly focused on. And this is a period that I think one might call the crux of modernity for a few reasons. So, first of all, Holderlin is writing in the wake of the French Revolution, and in the moment of the Napoleonic Wars. So, in that sense, we're situated here at a really key moment in the political history of modernity, when a generation of thinkers in Germany are grappling with the political consequences and indeed the philosophical consequences of what's happening in France and then what's going on during the Napoleonic Wars, which of course will spread to Germany and throughout Europe. So the wake of the French Revolution is a crucial political and historical determination of the moment in which Holderlin is writing. Second, Holderlin is writing in the wake of Kant's critical philosophy. So Immanuel Kant publishes the Critique of Pure Reason in its first edition in 1781. He'll then publish his second critique, a revision of the first critique, and then his third critique, the Critique of the Power of Judgment, within that same decade. And the whole generation of German thinkers and poets and artists, of which Holderlin is a part, will be grappling with the consequences of Kant's critical philosophy. I'll say more about Holderlin's relationship to that and to Kant in a moment. This is also, of course, in that same vein, the moment of the development of German idealism in philosophy. Fichte gives his lectures on the foundation of the Wissenschaftslehre, the doctrine of science, in 1794 in Jena. And Holderlin is in Jena for part of those lectures. So he's following the development of Fichte's philosophy very closely in the wake of Kant. Holderlin is also very close friends, in fact, roommates for a while at the theological seminary in Tübingen of Schelling and of Hegel. So Holderlin is in the thick of the development of German idealism, and indeed he very well could have been a philosopher, but it's not his vocation. His vocation is to become a poet. So a large part of what we'll be thinking about in this seminar is the relationship between poetry and philosophy at the crux of modernity and during the development of German idealism. So all of these thinkers of Holderlin's generation and all of the writers of Holderlin's generation then, because of these historical, political, and philosophical determinations, are grappling with many of the same questions. And I'll just mention 5 of them that are particularly important for what we're going to be thinking through in the seminar. So first of all, the problem of freedom, which is emerging in a new way out of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and particularly the relationship of Kant's philosophy to Spinoza's philosophy, which Holderlin has a particular interest in. So this is a question we can come back to. So first, the problem of freedom. Second, the question of knowledge of the absolute. So Fichte, Schelling, Hegel are all concerned with the fate of absolute knowledge, or with what they call intellectual intuition, in the wake of Kant's critical philosophy, which of course tries to delimit the purview of what we can know, and in a sense at least, delimits our capacity to know the absolute. Even if we can think it, we can't render it through cognition. And this is a problem that Fichte, that Schelling, that Hegel are all grappling with in their own way. And in this class, we'll be thinking about the way that Holderlin is thinking about and approaching poetry as a kind of organon of the absolute, as a kind of organ, a mode of thinking, a mode of reflection, and indeed a form of material inscription through which the absolute can be registered and inscribed. And we'll be thinking about what that has to do with the intersection of being and history. Third, the concept of the tragic is very important to Holderlin, as it is to Schelling and as it is to Hegel. And so we'll be thinking about what the tragic and tragedy have to do also with this problem of, well, the problem of freedom and the problem of knowledge of the absolute. Fourth, the development of a kind of dialectical thinking in German philosophy through Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, of course, but also in Holderlin's own poetic process. And if you read some of the prose writings that were assigned as secondary texts for this session, you'll be aware of how complicated Holderlin's mode of dialectical reflection is. And I should say, we're not going to focus too much, at least I'm not in my lectures, on Holderlin's so-called poetological writings, on his theory of poetry, but that's all fair game for discussion and questions, and for your own discussion posts if you're a certificate student. So I'm going to try to focus on the poems and not get lost in those theoretical writings, but those are also available to think about. And finally, the significance of modernity, our main theme to some degree. So the five questions or problems are freedom, the absolute, the tragic, the dialectic, and modernity. Um, so we'll be thinking about the relationship between poetry and philosophy as modes of approaching those questions or problems at the crux of modernity. Um, Again, we'll be focusing on four poems. So I want to keep things contained by delimiting the number of poems that we'll deal with so that we can really get into them. So those four poems are going to be Bread and Wine, The Rhine, Patmos, and Remembrance. So each week we'll start off by working through one of those poems. I've already mentioned the structure of the seminar, these three parts: lecture, Q&A, and then discussion. And we'll come back to the assignments and the syllabus in the last 30 to 20 minutes of the course today. Okay, so with those preliminaries out of the way, let me offer, well, I suppose some more preliminaries. That is just some brief notes on Holderlin's life. Perhaps some of you know quite a bit about Holderlin, and this will be a basic review, certainly at the level of what you could glean from Michael Hamburger's introduction to Holderlin's poems. But I do want to just outline a few things to sort of get us on the same page. So this will be very brief, and then I'll talk about what I have in mind by the pathos of modernity. So now I'm going to go to screen share. Okay. So here's a very basic rundown of some biographical information about Holderlin that will help us maybe to situate him. So he lives from 1770 to 1843. He's born in Laufen am Neckar in Swabia. That is the region of Germany around the Black Forest, close to the French border, relatively close to Strasbourg. Holderlin's father died when he was 2 years old, and his stepfather would then die when he was 9. And this has a major effect on Holderlin's psyche. I'll mention a couple books that you might be interested in along those lines in a moment. The first poems that we have from Holderlin are from 1784, so when he's 14 years old. And then in 1788 until 1793, so this is the moment, the French Revolution begins in 1789, the moment of the kind of fervor of the French Revolution and its impact upon Germany. During this period, Holderlin attended the theological seminary, that should say seminary, in Tübingen, and his roommates were Schelling and Hegel. So quite a constellation of thinkers. Holderlin never took up the role of minister that he qualified for by going to the seminary. He did not feel called to be a Lutheran minister, but rather a poet and a thinker. He moved to Jena in 1794, where he met Goethe and frequented Schiller's house. He got to know Schiller very well. Schiller was a kind of mentor for him. And he attended Fichte's lectures, as I mentioned, in 1794. Um, Holderlin then would work as a tutor for a number of families. This was his major source of income. And none of these tutoring engagements tended to end poorly, with Holderlin leaving, sometimes for reasons we don't know, sometimes because of an affair with someone in the household, etc. The most notable example is that he worked in the household of Jacob Gontard in Frankfurt from 1796 until 1798 and fell in love with Gontard's wife, Suzette Gontard, um, and was deeply in love with Suzette Gontard, and they had a passionate affair for several years until Suzette died in 1802, which was a shattering event for Holderlin. But for much of that time, they were merely corresponding by letters. Holderlin had to leave the Gontard household in 1798 after a confrontation with Jacob Gontard. So this is a key node in Holderlin's life, and he'll write of Suzette Gontard as Diotima, which will figure importantly in his novel Hyperion. Holderlin then takes tutoring positions in Switzerland in 1801 and crucially in Bordeaux in 1802. And we'll be looking in some detail at his period in Bordeaux during the fourth session when we focus on the poem Remembrance. Eventually, Holderlin, who has already suffered from sort of precarious mental health throughout much of the late 1790s, will suffer a full mental breakdown in 1806, and he'll be committed to a mental asylum in Tübingen on his mother's instructions. And so this is the true break in Holderlin's life, where he spends uh, he spends the majority of a year in this mental institution in Tübingen, where, for example, a mask is put on his face so that he can't scream, etc. He's treated, I would say, quite brutally. And this breaks Holderlin to some degree for the rest of his life. He'll be released from that asylum, the Ottenrieth Clinic, in 1807, into the care of a carpenter who has read Holderlin's novel Hyperion, Ernst Zimmer. And Zimmer and his family take care of Holderlin then for the remainder of his life until 1843. He lives in the upper room of a tower overlooking the river Neckar. So here, Holderlin returns to Tübingen and spends the entire second half of his life in Tübingen, really only going for walks outside of the tower and being cared for by this family. And during this period, he writes a good number of poems, but they're relatively simple poems compared to his previous output. If you want to read about Holderlin's mental interest, or mental illness, which is of course of great interest, I would recommend two books in particular. So Jean Laplanche's Holderlin and the Question of the Father, which is a great book on Holderlin's relationship to Schiller in particular. And then Giorgio Agamben's more recent book, Holderlin's Madness, Chronicle of a Dwelling Life, which really gives you a chronology, a chronicle of Holderlin's life in the Tower. And Agamben's book, I think, is really quite an excellent treatment of the second half of Holderlin's life. So those are just some brief biographical notes. Let's see if I can change the slide. Yeah. Okay, Holderlin writes in a number of different um, poetic forms, and his poetic production is normally divided up into, let's say roughly 5 periods. So he writes odes and epigrams, um, and sort of simple hymns, primarily in the early period of his poetic production. Then he begins to write hexameters and elegies. So all of these poems are poems written in particular Greek meters and rhythms. We might have some time to talk more about those formal details as we go through the sessions, although that can be a little complex it's a little bit outside the purview of our seminar. But Bread and Wine is a great example of one of Holderlin's elegies written in the Greek form of dactylic hexameter. Then a later period, sort of from 1799, really 1800 until 1806, when he's writing his great hymns and fragments. And then in the Tower, He'll write shorter poems, certainly simpler poems. He'll go back to writing rhyming poems, which Agamben, I think, quite convincingly argues should be regarded as idols. These are mostly seasonal poems or occasional poems. So, okay, then we can think about the career spanning five different periods, roughly speaking. From 1784 to 1788, Holderlin's Juvenilia. From 1788 to 1796, his kind of poetic apprenticeship, where he's writing in a more derivative style, particularly under the influence of Schiller. 1796 to 1799, the more mature odes, some of his first shorter hymns, and his hexameters and elegies, his first hexameters and elegies. And then the great period of Holderlin's poetic production from 1800 to 1806, when he writes poems like Bread and Wine and the Rhine and Patmos and Andenken that we'll be reading. Holderlin at this time is sometimes he's writing in dactylic hexameter and Greek meters, as in Bread and Wine. But then, as you'll see, particularly in a poem like Patmos, Holderlin is writing in free verse. So Holderlin has a claim to be one of the earliest poets working in free verse in European poetry. He also writes during this period many fragments of poems that are unfinished. And then from 1807 to 1843, the poems of the Tower period, the later poems, which I've mentioned. And then he wrote in several other genres. So, as I mentioned, he wrote a novel, Hyperion, published the first part in 1797, the second part in 1799. He wrote a mourning play, what we might think of as a tragedy, in three different versions, each of which was incomplete, but in my view, the first is the most substantial. The Death of Empedocles from 1798 to 1800. And Holderlin is also a great translator from the Greek. He's a scholar of Greek poetry, also of Latin poetry. Throughout his life, he sustains a very deep engagement with Greek philosophy and literature. So he translates Pindar, and he does famous translations of Sophocles, of Oedipus Rex, and of Antigone, and of parts of other plays, which are then published in 1804. Okay, so those are my introductory notes on Holderlin. I'm going to stop the screen share for now and then come back to it in a moment. Let me say something about what I mean by the pathos of modernity. So first of all, what do I mean by modernity in the broadest sense? So for me, perhaps not for Holderlin, what I mean above all is the history of capitalism. So the history of capitalism and the development of its structural determinations, for the mode of production and the class relation, et cetera, and all of the political and cultural transformations that go along with that. I don't necessarily mean this in a sort of determinist sense, but in a structurally framing sense that the transition to the capitalist mode of production and its development is the constitutive feature of what we think of as the time of modernity. But that, of course, is attended by many religious, political, scientific, cultural transformations. So, of course, the scientific revolution, the period of European colonialism and transatlantic slavery. We'll come back to that when we're thinking about Holderlin's poem Andenken, which brings him into contact with the whole Atlantic world, as we'll see. The Protestant Reformation, democratic and republican revolutions, etc. For Holderlin, above all, I think, the key sort of feature of modernity is its relation to antiquity. Right, so this is something that we're going to come back to throughout the seminar, but particularly with Bread and Wine. What's the relationship between modernity and antiquity, and how is that experienced by someone who is obsessed with the Greeks like Holderlin? So many themes in Holderlin's stem from this problem of the difference between antiquity and modernity. The relationship between polytheism and monotheism, and how both might be folded into a kind of pantheism for Holderlin. the relationship between myth and enlightenment, and the theme running throughout most of Holderlin's work of the withdrawal and the possible return of the gods. And we can talk about what that means. It's a very delicate problem in Holderlin. Um, I want to stress that Holderlin cannot be understood as an anti-enlightenment thinker. So this is one sort of idea about what German Romanticism is, that supposedly German Romanticism or Romanticism in general is kind of anti-enlightenment, anti-rationalist movement. Um, of course, people don't think that for no reason, and there are some elements of truth to it. But Holderlin, of course, um, is himself very much in the vein of the German Enlightenment as well. So, as I've mentioned, he's constitutively influenced by the advent of Kant's critical philosophy. Um, and even in his relationship to the Greeks, of course, it's the German Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, that recovers so much of Greek literature and culture. So, for example, Johann Winckelmann's famous and important book, a very crucial book in art history, History of Ancient Art, is published in 1764. That's a key contribution to the German Enlightenment that just has a huge influence on Holderlin's entire generation. Um, so I think it's erroneous, and we can talk about this as we go through the seminar, to think about German Romanticism, and in particular Holderlin, as kind of anti-Enlightenment figure. But if we think of Enlightenment, as many have done, as the disenchantment of the world, then I would say that Holderlin, this kind of disenchantment is very much a problem for him, and what he thinks of as kind of the destitute time of modernity. That Holderlin certainly is a kind of partisan of the re-enchantment of the world, particularly through poetry and by art. So the withdrawal of the gods attends this disenchantment of the world, which one might associate with enlightenment. So all I want to flag is that Holderlin's relationship to the German Enlightenment and Enlightenment more broadly is a difficult and complicated question. Holderlin loves Rousseau, for example, who is a kind of prototypical French Enlightenment thinker and also a Romantic thinker. So these oppositions can be unhelpful, and we want to think in a complicated way about the relationship between Romanticism and Enlightenment. With that in mind, let me go back to screen share and let's take a look at a few passages from Schiller that will help to orient us to the way that Holderlin and his generation are thinking about the relation of antiquity to modernity and thinking about the problem and the pathos of modernity. Okay, so uh, we're going to look at some passages from Schiller's great essay on naive and sentimental poetry, which was published in 1795 to 1796. Holderlin, of course, would have read this essay and its companion piece, Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, immediately. And they would have had an absolutely massive influence on Holderlin's thinking about poetry and aesthetics and the relationship between modernity and antiquity. So let me just read you some passages from, first of all, on naive and sentimental poetry for thinking about what Schiller means by sentimental poetry and how he's thinking about these two different forms of poetry as ways of approaching the relationship between antiquity and modernity. So when Schiller is speaking about our encounters with natural things and their simplicity, as he says, we treasure the silent creativity of life in them, the fact that they act serenely on their own, being there according to their own laws. We cherish that inner necessity, that eternal oneness with themselves. They are what we were. They are what we should become once more. We were nature like them, like things of nature. And our culture should lead us along the path of reason and freedom back to nature. So nature is what we were. We were nature, and now culture, reason, and freedom should lead us back to nature. This is how Schiller situates the problem of the time of modernity. Um, he says, by virtue of the very notion of a poet, poets are everywhere the guardians of nature. Where they can no longer completely be this, and where they have already experienced within themselves the destructive influence of arbitrary and artificial forms, or have had to contend with them, they will appear as nature's witnesses and avengers. They will either be nature or seek the lost nature. Two completely different manners of poetry spring from this fact, exhausting and demarcating the entire realm of poetry. Depending on the character of the age in which they flourish or on the impact that contingent circumstances have on their general formation and their passing states of mind, all poets who really are such will be either naive or sentimental. And again, Schiller will say, the poet, I say, either is nature, naive, right, or will seek it. The former makes for the naive poet, and the latter the sentimental poet. Okay, so the naive poet is nature. The sentimental poet seeks nature, is separated from it, and seeks it. A couple more passages from this influential essay. And here he's thinking about the Greeks and the relation of modernity and antiquity. Recall the beauty of nature surrounding the ancient Greeks. Consider how confidently this people was able, under its serendipitous sky, to live with nature in the wild. Consider how very much nearer to the simplicity of nature lay its manner of thinking, its way of feeling, its mores, and what a faithful copy of this is provided by the works of its poets. If one reflects on these things, then the observation must appear strange that one encounters there so few traces of the sentimental interest we moderns attach to nature's settings and characteristics. There is, of course, no depiction of these scenes more exact, faithful, and detailed than that of the Greek. However, the depiction is not more exact, faithful, and detailed, and contains no more special involvement of the heart than the depiction of a dress, a shield, a weapon, a household tool, or some sort of mechanical product. He seems, in his love for the object, to make no distinction between what is of itself and what is through art and human will. Nature seems of no more interest to his intellect and thirst for knowledge than to his moral feeling. He does not cling to nature with the fervor, sensitivity, and sweet melancholy we moderns do. Okay, so here, although this can become more complicated, Schiller is mapping the distinction between the naive and the sentimental onto the ancients and the moderns, right? The ancients are naive insofar as they are nature. Nature is there for them. They describe it in the same way that they do products of art, right? In this way, they make no distinction, we might say, between physis and techne. And their poiesis, their art, is identical with the identical relation of physis and techne. This would be one way of reading these claims of Schiller's. That is to say, nature, um, technology or the making of things, and poiesis, the productivity, the flowing forth of poetry, are one and the same. That's what he thinks of as the naive. But we moderns, he says, we cling to nature with fervor, sensitivity, and sweet melancholy in the way the Greeks did not. They don't have to be melancholic because, in this account, they are, as it were, nature itself. Um, then Schiller asks, whence indeed comes this different spirit? How is it that we are so infinitely surpassed by the ancients in everything that is natural? And yet, precisely at this point, we are able to revere nature to a higher degree, to cling to it more intimately, and to embrace even the inanimate world with the tenderest of feelings. This is because nature has disappeared from our humanity, and we re-encounter it in its genuineness only outside humanity in the natural world. Not our greater naturalness, but the very opposite. The unnaturalness of our relationships, conditions, and mores forces us to fashion a satisfaction in the physical world that is not to be hoped for in the moral world. They felt naturally while we feel the natural. Okay, so this quality of feeling, pathos, is crucial here. Um, the Greeks' feelings were themselves naturally. We feel the natural as something separated from us and desired by us. And this is precisely due to the unnaturalness of our relationships, due to our separation from nature. So these are key passages that would have been upmost of mind in Holderlin's manner of thought, um, throughout the period after they were published. Okay, let's look at as well at uh, some passages from Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, also published in 1795, quite a banner year to publish both of these incredible long essays in the same year, right in the middle of the 1790s. Here, Schiller is thinking about what's the purpose of the work of art? And what's the effect of the experience of the work of art, of aesthetic experience in this case? So Holderlin says, Schiller says, nature deals no better with man than with the rest of her works. She acts for him as long as he is as yet incapable of acting for himself as a free intelligence. But what makes him man is precisely this, that he does not stop short at what nature herself made of him, but has the power of retracing by means of reason the steps she took on his behalf, of transforming the work of blind compulsion into a work of free choice, and of elevating physical necessity into moral necessity. Okay, so this is the problem of the relationship between what Schiller calls the natural state and the moral state. Okay, uh, the distinction of man, according to Schiller, from the rest of nature is that we have the power of retracing our genesis by means of reason and of transforming blind compulsion, we might say instinct, into free choice, right? So this is the advent of freedom. Our freedom involves the transformation of nature into something that we determine, something like a moral state. So, in addition to natural laws, we also have moral laws, and we can bring about a cultural and political situation which is guided by moral laws. That sort of political order is what Schiller has in mind when he speaks of the moral state. But there's a problem with this, which is the problem of transition. He says, what we must chiefly bear in mind then is that physical society in time, so the natural state, must never for a moment cease to exist while moral society as idea is in the process of being formed. Okay, so we're always going to be natural beings. We are organisms, we are animals. But as we try to bring about a moral society through the idea, which we can think through the use of reason, um, we have to sustain our physical society while also transforming it into a moral society. This is the problem of freedom. It requires, we might say, mediation between feeling and thinking, between sensation and reason, or between nature and morality. So this problem of transition, of bringing freedom into the actual world without violating our nature, uh, is the problem of modernity for Schiller. And we can see here how he's thinking. He's thinking in the wake of Kant, and he's thinking in the wake of the French Revolution. How can we produce a moral state without losing ourselves? Um, he says the transition from a passive state of feeling to an active state of thinking and willing cannot then take place except through a middle state of aesthetic freedom. So aesthetic experience and art will be the mediator between nature and freedom. And although this state can of itself decide nothing as regards either our insights or our convictions, thus leaving both our intellectual and moral worth as yet entirely problematic, it is nevertheless the necessary precondition of our attaining any insight or conviction at all. Aesthetic experience is a condition of possibility for bringing about the moral world, according to Schiller. In a word, this is no other way uh, of making sensuous man rational. There is no other way of making sensuous man rational except by first making him aesthetic. Okay, so the aesthetic, the experience of artworks of beauty, mediates between the sensuous and the rational. We don't want to be entirely sensuous, and we don't want to be entirely rational. We need the mediation of aesthetic experience. And one thing that I want to point out, which is crucial for thinking about pathos, is that this involves then a mediation of what we could call receptivity, right? Our exposure to what happens to us, our ability to be receptive to experience, and on the other hand, determination or productivity, right? That we determine our experience in accordance with our concepts, or perhaps in accordance with political principles. Um, we determine our moral state in accordance with rational principles, or at least we attempt to. So there's a mediation of receptivity and determination, which Schiller calls determinability. So it's determinability which is cultivated by the aesthetic state and the freedom of aesthetic play. So Schiller here is completely immersed in Kant's critical system, and he's thinking through the implications and consequences of it for the role of art. He says, beauty is indeed form because we contemplate it, but it is at the same time life because we feel it. In a word, it is at once a state of being and an activity that we perform. Okay, so beauty involves contemplation and feeling, form and life. These come together in the artwork. Um, okay, we'll take off screen share for a moment. So that's a little, 101 on Schiller. And this sort of thing takes up a little more time today than normally I'll spend on these kind of introductory materials. But it's necessary to begin our course because of Schiller's massive influence on Hölderlin. And Schiller, I think, allows us to think through what is at stake in what I'm calling the pathos of modernity. So the category of pathos. Um, those two essays offer an approach to this question and this problem. What is the pathos of modernity? So partly it's this feeling of separation, the feeling of being separated from our identity with nature. Marx is also a great theorist of separation. Um, he refers to the division of labor, the transformation of the capitalist mode of production by the Industrial Revolution as a Scheidungsprozess, right? A process of separation. So part of the pathos of modernity is this feeling of separation from nature, our non-identity with it. But it's also the feeling of the advent of freedom, the actuality of freedom, the problem of inscribing the actuality of our freedom in our political systems, in our actual world, which is at a point of high tension during the process of the French Revolution, not least, as we'll see when we get to Andenken and the sort of liminal world that it comes into contact with, because of course, the Haitian Revolution is going on at the same time as the French Revolution. Hölderlin probably doesn't know much about that, but we're at a moment where the persistence of slavery, the abolition of slavery, the reestablishment of slavery by Napoleon in the early 1800s, all of this attends the process and the outcome of the French Revolution in a deeply complicated and contradictory manner. So the problem of freedom is also the feeling of the pathos of modernity. And the term pathos, okay, so if you look it up in the OED, in the Oxford English Dictionary, right, it means something which evokes sadness or sympathy, right? So it's kind of literary type. Or, Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony is titled Pathétique, right? So pathos is that which evokes sadness or sympathy or pity or tenderness. But the root of the word, right, it means essentially to suffer. Path, that stem, means to suffer, the Greek root. And so if you look up what it means to suffer, the word to suffer doesn't just mean, to be in pain, but more fundamentally, um, to undergo something, to endure something, to be affected by something. So to be the object rather than the subject of an action. So here we see the complexity of the pathos of modernity as it attends the question of freedom. To be free is to be the subject of an action, but to feel the problem of freedom, right, is to be the object of the possibility of freedom, to feel its problematic nature at the crux of modernity. So pathos, to suffer, to be affected, to undergo, to endure, to be acted upon. So pathos involves receptivity, openness to experience. So if we are in pain when we suffer, it's because pathos is the condition of possibility for experiencing pain, right? An openness to the world that makes us receptive to what happens to us, being affected. So the pathos of modernity means that the experience of modernity is that which one must undergo, that which one must suffer. Yet also, at the same time, that which solicits freedom or an activity of determination. And we'll see how in Holderlin, this relationship between receptivity and activity or productivity, between determination and receptivity, is crucial to the capacity of poetry. The poem is a synthesis of activity and receptivity. So the modern poem is produced within and by the pathos of modernity, the feeling of the unfolding and the contradictions of modernity as we undergo them. It's formed in and as the sensuous and emotional experience of its time. So one undergoes the sensuous experience of undergoing modernity, but one forms it, right? This is the poem. And in doing so, through the synthesis of form and sensuousness, which is the aesthetic, Schiller's theory, one transmits this feeling to the receptivity of the reader. So there's a question of pathos as the undergoing of experience, the suffering of experience, the feeling of that, the formation of that feeling into the determinacy of the poem, and then the reception of the determinacy of the poem, the interpretation of the poem by the reader. So we see the poem is a site of determination. When it's on the page, it's on the page. There may be problems of establishing text, etc., particularly in the case of Holderlin. But when we're reading, let's say, I don't know, Homburger's translation, or when we're reading the original German of Brot und Wein, right, the poem is there. But now our interpretation of it becomes ambiguous. Our feeling about the experience of the poem is something that has to be interpreted. So we go from feeling to determination to feeling and receptivity and its synthesis with determination again. This is the problem of the production and the reception of the poem. So the poem then, or the artwork in Schiller, or the poem and elements of Holderlin's theory, is a sort of organ of cultivation, of Bildung, right, of development. But it's one that doesn't operate through doctrine. It works through a kind of strange mingling of determination and indeterminacy that Schiller calls determinability. Okay, to start with and to wrap up this opening lecture, let's take a look at a couple sections from the two main poems for today. So Bread and Wine and As on a Holiday. And I've got these. I've sort of cut and paste from the ebook to get these up in facing German and English. And I can screen share. Okay, so here is one of the most famous passages in all of Holderlin's poetry, and probably one of the most important passages for thinking about the pathos of modernity. So this is strophe 7. We'll come back to the form of the poem in a minute, of Bread and Wine. So Holderlin writes, but my friend, we have come too late. Though the gods are living, over our heads they live, up in a different world. Endlessly there they act, and such is their kind wish to spare us, little they seem to care whether we live or do not. For not always a delicate vessel can hold them. Only at times can our kind bear the full impact of gods. Ever after our life is a dream about them. But frenzy, wandering helps like sleep. Night and distress make us strong, till in that cradle of steel, heroes enough have been fostered. Hearts in strength can match heavenly strength as before. Thundering then they come. But meanwhile, too often I think it's better to sleep than to be friendless as we are, alone, always waiting. And what to do or to say in the meantime, I don't know. And who wants poets at all in lean years? But they are, you say, like those holy ones, priests of the wine god, who in holy night roamed from one place to the next. Okay, so if you know German, you'll undoubtedly be maybe troubled by some problems of translation, but we're going to have to work with these poems in English. I will say these key lines here, the third last line right here, I would prefer to translate as, well, above that, and what to do and what to say meanwhile, I do not know, and wherefore poets in a destitute time. Wozu Dichter. Wherefore poets, and wherefore poets in a dürftiger, so it kind of, yeah, destitute or dry. Lean years, I understand it, but I would translate that perhaps as a desolate or a destitute time. So this is one of Holderlin's main questions. Let me translate it this way. Wherefore poets in a desolate time, right? What is poetry for in this time of the withdrawal of the gods, as he puts it in this poem? So in this strophe, right, this stanza, we get a rendering of, first of all, modernity as belatedness. We have come too late. Modernity is a time of our separation from the gods. They're alive, they still live, but over our heads, up in a different world. We're separated from the gods. The gods are not imminent to the world that we live in and to our own spirits. We've undergone a separation from the imminence of polytheism. Um, we live in a disenchanted world, one might say, a desolate time. Interestingly, Holderlin will say, right, frenzy and wandering, right? So irsal, um, uh, one could translate that as maybe errancy, perhaps even madness, the kind of errancy um, and wandering help, like sleep, night and distress make us strong. Okay, so this errancy or madness or frenzy or night and need or night and sort of crisis or desperation or distress, these are what will make us strong in the desolate time of modernity. We'll come back to the beginning of the poem and think about night and some of these claims. Holderlin imagines a rebirth of an age of heroes um, who would be adequate to the gods. This, I would say, is a rather fascinating and kind of troubling passage in relationship to the emergence of German fascism and Nazism later on. And one might find here the kind of line that the Nazis will eventually take advantage of to sort of pretend that Holderlin is kind of proto-fascist or proto-German nationalist poet. In fact, Holderlin was a partisan of a Swabian Republic and of the French Revolution. So his politics are not at all, I would say, along those lines. But indeed, his poems were handed out in little booklets um, to Nazi troops during the Second World War. So the politics of all that are also issues that we can come back to. Um, uh, the question is, what are poets for in this destitute time? And Holderlin then will say they're like priests of the wine god, so Dionysian priests. And here it's Nietzsche who he anticipates, particularly in The Birth of Tragedy, priests who roamed in holy night from one place to the next. So here the figure of the poet is the figure of the mediator, um, between the gods and the humans. They're like Dionysian priests, who wander. Okay, but then let's take a look here from As on a Holiday, Wie wenn am Feiertage, which I would prefer to translate actually, although it would be controversial, as on a day of rest, because Feiertage can just be like Sunday, a day off. It's not necessarily, certainly not a holiday in our sense where you go traveling somewhere, but a day of rest or a feast day, or a holiday. We'll come back to this poem a little more, but here I want to focus on um, this stanza, this strophe at the bottom of the page. And as a fire gleams in the eye of that man who has conceived a lofty design, once more by the tokens, the deeds of the world now, a fire has been lit in the souls of poets. And that which happened before, but hardly was felt, only now is manifest. And they who smilingly worked our fields for us, assuming the shape of laborers, now are known, the all alive, all animating powers of the gods. And then he says something interesting about the gods. Do you ask where they are? In song, their spirit wafts. Okay, so this is crucial. The gods exist in song. For example, in Pindar's odes, in Homer's epics, in Greek tragedies, or in modern poems, which sentimentally recall them. You ask where they are, in song their spirit wafts or drifts. That's where we can find the gods in poetry. Um, but here in the previous strophe, we can see here that the pathos of modernity, the feeling of modernity, is the advent of freedom and recognition, or freedom and equality and recognition. I would put it that way in these key lines. And what happened before but hardly was felt, only now is manifest. And they who smilingly worked our fields for us, assuming the shape of laborers, right? Knechtgestalt, right? So in the form of serfs or slaves or servants. The most proximate German here would be serfs, right? So the feudal social relations of serfdom, right, now are known, erkannt, recognized, known. The all alive, the all living, the power of the gods. So these people who were merely laborers, who worked the fields for us, now are recognized. And they are recognized as the all living, as the power of the powers of the gods, or the power of the gods. Um, I guess it's plural, the powers of the gods. So this is also something about the advent of modernity, as the advent of freedom and equality. So here, modernity is not a desolate time, but the time of the manifestation of what was only implicit before, the possibility of freedom and equality and of recognition. It's a strong reading of this passage, but given the word Knechtsgestalt, that's how I would read this, the recognition of those who previously were merely serfs. Um, so the time of the French Revolution. So this is another pole, let's put it that way, of the pathos of modernity. So the pathos of modernity, I would put it this way, rather than opposing these two forms of feeling, desolation and the advent of freedom, let's put it that way, um, it's the very tension and opposition or contradiction between these. The feeling of the torque of the relationship between desolation um, and the possibility of freedom, the advent of freedom in history, in modernity. This tension or conflict would be something like the historical absolute, not one or the other, but their contradiction, to put it in dialectical terms. This kind of rift, which implies the need of a synthesis, and this feeling of the need for a synthesis of the riven is something like the pathos of modernity. That's the way, at least, that I'm thinking about this problem to begin the course. So let me pause. We'll do things a little bit differently in this session. I'll pause now, and then we'll go back to olive bread and wine. Let me pause right now for some questions or comments that people might have. And we can discuss those, let's say for about 20 minutes, and then we can take a short break, and then we can come back and take a close look at bread and wine, and then wrap up by talking about assignments in the syllabus. So I already see a comment. Begum Guven, is that a adequate pronunciation of your name, hopefully?
Yeah, yeah. It's big.
Okay. Do you want to pose your question, or I could read it? Do you want to?
I think it's mainly the command is enough, but like I thought that like I felt like that the beginning of the poem, like the part of the poem that you wrote, and the end of the part of the poem was somehow what's like relevant with one another, but there was like a tension in the middle. Like he talks about night and distress and
Mhm.
pose a question, and I was like, What is going on there?" And I felt like maybe you talked about the question of tragedy, and he does have a. I think Hyperion is sort of like a tragedy, uh,
Mhm.
and there's like the birth of the genius now, but that genius poet is kind of erratic in their movements
Uh-huh.
because kind of God left them, but also the tragedy left them. But God
Mhm.
did not. Gods did not die. They're still there
Mhm.
somewhere, but
Mhm.
they're like left us unattended. So
Mhm.
I wanted to ask whether it's like the hopeless aim at like trying to connect back and try to dissolve the separation, like go back
Mhm.
to time, but in a different way. I
Yeah,
just yeah, I was connecting them in my mind.
I think it's a great question. And I think that this is totally, your question is completely bound up with the way that Schiller is thinking about the naive and the sentimental. That it's not just for him that being a sentimental poet, separated from nature, or in this case, separated from the gods, and therefore having a melancholic relation to him. This is not only a problem, but also a crucial possibility of modernity. That for Schiller, precisely that separation is attended by our freedom, right? By it's attended by our non-identity with nature, is precisely the site of the emergence of the possibility of something other than simply natural law, of identity with nature. And and for Schiller, then, it's the moderns who have to grapple with the problem of freedom in this new way, as the problem of our separation from nature and the task of bringing about a moral state. So, one thing I think we can see that you're putting your finger on in Holderlin's poem is that in Holderlin's poem, this has to do with a certain orientation toward, right, the pathos of separation, which has to do with the great romantic theme, let's say, of striving, Streben, or of yearning, Sehnsucht, right? So these great themes of yearning and striving here are formalized by Holderlin through the figure of the withdrawal of the gods and our yearning for their return, or our capacity to be adequate to them. And so this is something which is specific to modernity. It's not a problem in Schiller's account or in Holderlin's account that the Greeks had, right? When the gods are imminent to our lives, we don't have this problem of freedom and the project of striving. And that project of striving is what opens up the sort of vocation of poetry in modernity. Okay, two more questions. So first, Nikos, and then Lynn.
Hi everyone. I just had two remarks maybe for about the poem As on Holiday and on something we said previously. I will start with when you were reading Schiller, I was kind of thinking, because you mentioned something about the natural state as a state of being, and another one as an act of freedom, and the kind of discrepancy between the state of being and an act. And I think that for me, especially because we're talking also a lot about historical determination and sort of how modernity was seen in from people like Hegel and Fichte and all of these. Um, what I'm trying to get at is that it seems as if there is this almost infinite gap between these two. It's almost as if, you know, the past has now gone, but the future was never going to arrive, sort of thing.
Hmm.
So, yeah, for me, it has it. I don't know if that's something that is kind of implied here, but I got this feeling of this infinite, but also infinitesimal time within human history that it feels like time is frozen. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was on the section of the poem As on Holiday about the laborers, which I will have in front of me. One second. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was kind of funny because I had a kind of different interpretation because I thought in a way that what he was kind of speaking or trying to imply was that the gods were within sort of the laborers through their capacity as laborers. And I started thinking as, for example, you know, the idea that labor is how do you get a modification of nature, let's say, which is something that perhaps
Hmm.
was only accorded to gods in the past.
Hmm.
Um, and there is something about it that, you know, it's almost like a Marxist reading in the sense that
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
laborers produce their own freedom, produce their own means of freedom.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that would be a sort of Hegelian and a kind of Marxist interpretation. I think that, right, I'm giving a very particular reading of that, situating it at the moment of the wake of the French Revolution. But I think the broader question we could just say is this claim of his, what was only before sort of implicit, has now become manifest. That's what sort of inscribes a historical differential in the passage, where it's like now it has become the case that these serfs or laborers or slaves are known, right? That they are recognized. Um, and this, I think, this is what I think demands interpretation in any case. Your questions about, your points about time, um, and I think are very important. And actually, we're going to come back to these when we look at the poem more broadly, because I think it's precisely a relationship between history and time, which is at stake in this poem, and the problem of a relationship between cyclical time and linear chronological time, and then the time of something like the event or of the return, or the time of manifestation in this passage, which is crucially at issue. So there certainly are large metaphysical and conceptual questions of temporality at stake here. So we'll definitely come back to those. Maybe a question from Lynn, and then maybe we can take a break and then come back to the poem as a whole, which will allow us to continue taking up some of these questions. Or if someone has questions also about just like the overall framing of the course, we could take one of those before the break. But Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have several questions actually,
Okay.
but
Okay.
they're quite broad, I would say. But yeah, you can choose which one to answer. Maybe they're also somehow commenting on the general, or they could be continued later on. But well, first, my first question is actually rather formal because I'm a bit familiar with ancient Greek. I mean, I'm very fascinated with this language, and I'm extremely curious if you could tell a little bit how he managed to transcribe the rhythm of ancient Greek language into German, because as I, well, I mean, as I understand, the main idea behind it, or behind the ancient Greek language, would be that the vowels would be of various length. So there is not really a rhyme in our sense, but there are different musical rhythms behind it. Whereas German language, of course, does have differentiations between various vowels, but still they're not so distinct as in ancient Greek. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I've read it in German actually, and I was very fascinated with the way he deals with syntax in general. Because I mean, I'm based in Germany, so German is familiar to me as a language which is super structural and predetermined by the way that each word is structured in a sentence, whereas Hölderlin actually breaks each rule of this pattern, which would be quite common for the German, or quite familiar to me, and I find it totally fascinating, and I'm really curious actually how it can be integrated, let's say, with the more conceptual things which can be seen in the content of it. So how does this formal aspect, which role does it play
Yeah.
within this broader context?
Yeah, great questions, very important questions. We'll come back to the form of the poem a little bit in a moment when we look at the whole thing. For now, I'll just say yes, you're exactly right, that the Greek meters and poetic forms are based on sort of the length of the vowel sounds, whereas uh, the poetics of Holderlin's German or indeed of English are based on counting syllables and transforming Greek meters into German or into English is extremely difficult, and Holderlin cannot do so in exactly the same way. He can't write exactly like Homer. But one of his foremost achievements as a poet, and what's not to be overlooked, is his really god level abilities as a poetic technician. Because so often we think of him as the philosophical poet. Commentary on Holderlin is so dominated by thematic interpretation, which this course as well will be. But if you get into the formal analysis of Holderlin's poetic achievement, he's an absolutely astonishing, formally competent poet. So what I think we can't get into it in too much detail, but what I can say very briefly is that these rhythms are going to depend on the alternation of sort of like um, a strong sort of opening stress and then two unstressed units, however you think of those units. So for example, if you look at, or at least a play between stressed and then unstressed and stressed syllables. If you look at the opening of the poem, Rings Ruhet die Stadt, you can feel that like rings, stressed syllable opening the line, dipping down into unstressed syllables, Ruhet die Stadt. Stadt has a strong stress on it. So we're moving back and forth between these stresses and unstressed rhythmic units. And Holderlin is attempting to do that in a manner which is proximate to dactylic hexameter, which is the meter of Homer's epics. In some of his other poems, for example, Patmos, he'll break with this, entirely they're very proximate there to Pindar's odes, but also Holderlin's own invention, and they can be very fragmentary. So in his essay Parataxics, which is assigned for one of the secondary readings of the seminar, Adorno thinks of parataxis, that is to say, the interruption of normal syntax or grammar, as one of the key elements of Holderlin's poetics. And one of the main operators of this is just the term aber, which is but a little lighter than but in German, almost like but, yet, or almost like a comma sometimes, that is a sort of grammatical operator of transition in Holderlin's poetics, and we'll take a look at that. In terms of Holderlin's German, yes, it's very complicated because relative to English, we're always dealing with grammatical inversion in German that then will have to be mapped into a different grammatical structure where the subject of the sentence comes first in the English sentence. However, I will just say, so on the one hand, we're dealing with the problem of the relationship between German and English grammar, and that's always going to impose major transformations on the translator. But then, as you also rightly point out, even beyond that, Hölderlin's German itself is very strange. It's very grammatically unusual, even more bound up with structures of grammatical inversion than German always is relative to English. So the English should feel strange, right? It shouldn't feel like normal English. And Hamburger, I think one thing, the translation has its flaws. But one thing that I think he's pretty good at is retaining certain elements of the strangeness of German in his English grammar. And I think that's very important. We don't want to eliminate that and smooth it over. Okay, I'll take two more questions before a break. Martin.
Yeah, I don't know if I can formulate this very well, but I guess I'm asking can you say a little bit more about what is specifically modern about this kind of pathos? Because this feeling of separation and the non-identity with nature is arguably precisely what's at issue in the ancient tragedies, right? In a sense of these conflicts between the polis as the sort of like as a kind of aspiration toward autonomy or collective freedom freedom in maybe a different sense, but nonetheless, a sort of freedom. And then running into conflicts with nature, perhaps embodied in the form of the family or kinship relations that we have like kind of no control over. So it seems to be there is that tension or a proto version of that tension within the ancients themselves. And I'm wondering if the crucial advent is less freedom and more like the demand for equality, or somehow like the way that freedom is reconceptualized under that demand for equality.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe that's getting too far afield, but it seems kind of relevant for the entire theme of the course. So if you could say anything about that, yeah.
No, it's very important, and it's again a really great question. I mean, I agree with you. Of course, it's very dangerous to set up these sort of schematic oppositions between antiquity and modernity. And as you point out, one of the most important theories of tragedy that we have is Jean-Pierre Vernon's theory of tragedy, which is all thinking through the relationship between what we might think of as kind of the age of heroes proper to Homeric epic and the age of the polis, which is at issue in 5th century Athens, the time of tragedy. And Vernon's theory, as Martin is pointing out and may well have in mind, is all about how the rationalism, the rationality of the polis and the new role of citizens and political democracy within it involves a sort of separation also from the immanence of the gods or the heroes that we might think of as the world of ancient epic. There are various versions of this kind of theory about Greek culture and its transition. Another one would be the advent of Plato's Academy and the sort of the force of critical reason rather than just the sort of mimesis of the ethos that we get in ancient epic, where part of the point of ancient epic is to relay to us the cultural norms of the society that we're meant to embody and repeat. That's why memorization is so crucial to the transmission of ancient epic. And Plato will come along with forms of critical reason that don't take anything for granted, right? Now you don't just have to be just, you're supposed to know what justice is. You're supposed to interrogate yourself on that question. So already we have something like a proto version of enlightenment that would be proper to the time of antiquity. So accepting all of that, I think that's true. Part of the reason I'm bringing Schiller forward is that I'm attempting to show that this is how, partly, these thinkers themselves were conceptualizing this problem in the 1790s. And of course, they're aware of many of the same ambiguities that you're pointing out. But I think central to it is the question of nature, right? And as we know, throughout like English Romantic poetry as well, the pathos of our relationship to nature is a very strong theme in Hölderlin and also in the English Romantic poets that I think is certainly more recessed in Greek literature. Now, of course, one might point to exceptions, but I don't think we find the kind of nature poetry in ancient epic or ancient tragedy, or even in Pindar that we do in Romantic poetry. And this would be the thing that Schiller is thinking of. Why is it that we're so attached to nature in this kind of sentimental, melancholic way? It's because we're separated from it. This wasn't necessarily like a problem or something thematized so heavily in Greek literature. But at the same time, yeah, I take your point. And always we want to think in a complex dialectical way about the relationship between antiquity and modernity. Let me put it this way. It's a dialectical move that you've made. If we say antiquity itself is not identical to itself, antiquity also is driven by the same kinds of divisions. Okay, but now those are recapitulated and transformed by the division between modernity and antiquity. So that very division itself is divided from a new form of that division. And the problems brought about in particular by political modernity, which here you're framing in terms of the relationship between freedom and equality. So I think that's very astute. Anyway, these are the kinds of questions at play. So yes, thanks for complicating the picture a little bit. One more question from Aaron, and then we'll pause for 5 minutes.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Martin. That was a great point, and I wanted to echo it a little bit. And maybe the more sort of classically literate people could point to like commonalities here, but I assume the important classical text would be Hesiod, right? And his sort of also like periodization of like his own time as a fall from the golden age and silver age and all of that kind of like sense also of desolation and separation from the world of the gods that yeah the poets of antiquity felt.
Mhm.
But I wanted to ask a more framing question before we got into the poetry. So
Sure.
let me know if this gets us too far afield. But I was curious also about this definition of modernity as a certain kind of pathos and also as coextensive with the history of capitalism, right? And I was trying to sort of contrast this with, I guess, what I'm now going to frame as like a Hegelian understanding of modernity is I'm taking Brandom here and it's phrased in the very unsexy Brandom way. But we can translate it back, right? Because I do think it applies not only to like the French Revolution. So for in Brandom's very unsexy framing, modernity is for Hegel the realization that normative statuses are dependent on normative attitudes, right? Um, and I do think you can take that, like, take a step back with it and apply it to artistic modernism as well, right? A kind of realization that certain values or frameworks of evaluating what a work of art does are just conventional and a kind of return from there to first principles in the same way that you can think of the French Revolution as a realization that the king's status is. And yeah, I'm just curious how this more kind of abstracted definition of modernity that we could attribute to Hegel, sort of how that would fit in, whether we're thinking of modernity as this unfinished, always unfinished thing as coextensive with capitalism or as this particular moment of like return and revitalization, right? And how that links to modernism and poetry, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, thank you. Also, a really great question. I mean, of course, there are many different theories of modernity, and that's why I'm sort of setting out by saying this is, I'm a Marxist. Let's let's just say broadly. So, I think of the history of modernity as the history of capitalism, and within that. That is to say, a transition to the capitalist mode of production as a condition of possibility for the kind of normative transformations of culture, of philosophy, and of politics that you have in mind, which we might think of the French Revolution as a kind of high moment of, holding it always in sort of contradiction in relation to the Haitian Revolution, and I think that. Um, yeah, the idea the sort of the idea that we can give ourselves the law, which is a Kantian problematic, which is then worked out in terms of a phenomenology of spirit by Hegel, that this is the problem of revolutionary republicanism, and this is the problem of Kant's philosophy, which is inherited as what I'm calling the problem of freedom. So this is certainly something which is uh, constitutive of modernity. It develops, I would say, at a relatively like at the middle point of modernity. So here I'm thinking of modernity as a period running from approximately like the 16th century up through, the present, which I think of as late modernity rather than post-modernity. Modernism is a separate question, right? Here we're dealing with romanticism as this moment of modernity sort of in contradiction with itself, undergoing this wrenching transformation where people, to put it sort of, loosely, are trying to figure out what is going on amid these intense political upheavals that bear upon every aspect of their lives. So yes, that's also very helpful. I want to say one more thing, just to take up Yazan's comment about the decline of the church and modern pathos. I would say also, in returning to both of these two questions about modernity and its relation to antiquity, that really it's for Holderlin, I think, the relationship between polytheism and monotheism, which is so crucial here. That the Greeks still had a relationship to the gods, which was polytheistic, where the elements of the natural world are imbued with the spirit of the gods. And this is what has, to some extent, been lost in modernity, and what we see in this sort of sentimental way as wanting to recover in our relationship to nature, that is to say, spirit. And for a figure like Holderlin, who's intensely reading Spinoza and who's trained as a Lutheran minister, even though he will not become one, all of this is also bound up with the relation of pantheism, the idea that spirit is imbued throughout the natural world, that God is nature, in Spinoza's sense. This intersects with the problem of freedom. We have a deterministic system in Spinoza, which for the German idealists was a huge problem insofar as it doesn't allow room for freedom. They're trying to think to reconcile the problem of freedom emerging from Kant and Fichte's philosophy with the sort of Spinozist rationalism. And Holderlin is also trying to hold that together with something like a polytheistic view of the elements, and a desire for, or a yearning for, the return of the gods that would be immanent to nature. And all of that is in conflict and also in relationship to his training in Protestant theology. So all of those questions are, roiling around in the poems. If we take a break now, we can come back and maybe see how some of them relate to bread and wine. So let's say we'll take a 5-minute break and we will return I'll start sharp at 3:35. Okay, thanks everybody. Want? Okay. So let's turn to the poem itself. And again, typically, this will be the way that I'll start the seminar, as we'll sort of begin at this point without having this introductory material. So we should have much more time for discussion subsequent weeks. Okay, let me say some things about bread and wine. Definitely one of Holderlin's most important poems, one of his most perfect specimens of working in Greek measures, Greek forms. This is from the high period of Holderlin's production, 1800, 1801. The poem unfolds in 9 strophes, or 9 stanzas. Strophe is a Greek term for a unit of poetry, as we would say stanza. It's the term that Holderlin's poems are usually discussed in. So 9 strophes consisting of 18 lines, except for strophe number 7, which only has 16 lines, which is interesting. That's the one with Wozu Dichter, the wherefore poets in a desolate time, which is a little bit compressed. And each of these strophes is structured in 3 parts. more or less. We can see this very clearly in the first two strophes, and we'll look at them in a moment. So internally, these 18 lines are structured in units of 6 lines. Often demarcations are grammatically indicated by terms like aber. So that's also the case in like an English sonnet, right? The transitions between quatrains, between 4 unit sections, or between the quatrains and the couplet will be demarcated by grammatical markers, conjunctions like and or but. Hölderlin does this as well. So these are extremely well-formed units of poetry. And this poem has a kind of completeness and perfection, which is rare in Hölderlin's later oeuvre. That's one of the strengths of his oeuvre, that many of the poems are fragments or they're worked in multiple drafts, etc. That's a very interesting element of his poetry. Here we have one might think of as a perfect poem written out in a clean draft. The initial title of this poem was The Wine God, Der Weingott. So to this extent, it's a poem about Dionysus and his relationship to Christ, which we can turn toward the end of the poem. But it starts out very simply. So let me read the first 2 strophes, and then we can talk about their development. So again, reading in Hamburger's English translation. Round us the town is at rest. The street in pale lamplight falls quiet, and their torches ablaze, coaches rush through and away. People go home to rest, replete with the day and its pleasures, there to weigh up in their heads pensive the gain and the loss, finding the balance good, stripped bare now of grapes and of flowers. As of their homemade goods, quiet the market stalls lie. But faint music of strings comes drifting from gardens. It could be someone in love who plays there, could be a man all alone, thinking of distant friends, the days of his youth, and the fountains, ever welling and raw, plash amid balm-breathing beds. Church bells ring. Every stroke hangs still in the quivering half-light, and the watchman calls out, mindful no less of the hour. Now a breeze rises too, and ruffles the crests of the coppice. Look, and in secret our globe's shadowy image, the moon, slowly is rising too. And night, the fantastical, comes now full of stars and, I think, little concerned about us. Night, the astonishing, there, the stranger to all that is human, over the mountain tops, mournful and gleaming, draws on. Marvelous is her favor, night's, the exalted, and no one knows what it is or whence comes all she does and bestows. So she works on the world and works on our souls, ever hoping. Not even wise men can tell what is her purpose, for so God the highest has willed, who very much loves you, and therefore dearer even than night, reasoning day is to you. Nonetheless, there are times when clear eyes too love the shadows, tasting sleep uncompelled, trying the pleasure it gives. Or a loyal man, too, will gaze into night and enjoy it. Yes, and rightly to her garlands we dedicate hymns, since to all those astray, the mad, and the dead, she is sacred. Yet herself remains firm, always, her spirit most free. But to us in her turn, so that in the wavering moment, deep in the dark, there shall be something, at least, that endures. Holy drunkenness she must grant, and frenzied oblivion. Grant the onrushing word, sleepless as lovers are too, and a wine cup more full, a life more intense and more daring, holy remembrance too, keeping us wakeful at night. Okay, I can put up the poem on screen share. I should have done that before I started reading, but here it is. So a few comments on these stanzas, these strophes as exemplary of the form of the poem. You hear that rhythm that Hamburger is careful to inscribe right in the beginning of the first line. Round us the town, right? So stressed, two unstressed units, and then another stressed unit, and then two unstressed, and then stressed. That's the rhythm of the dactylic hexameter that Hamburger is trying to draw out. Round us the town is at rest. And then you can see after the first 6 lines, the term aber, but, and then the last 6 lines, jetzt, now, right? These are dividing the units of the strophe into 3 sections. And indeed, we can see transitional moments between these structural units. We begin with the evening, right? The transition from the day into the evening, the transition from the sort of time of the bourgeois buying and selling of goods, right? Weighing up, calculating the gain and the loss, into the romance, I would say, of the night, which begins here, right? But faint music of strings comes drifting from gardens. It could be someone in love who plays there. So music, love, loneliness enters the poem as the things of the day are put away, and we pass through this transition into the evening. And now a breeze rises in the 3rd section of the opening strophe. So now demarcates this transition and the night, right? We pass from the evening into the night. And we see these famous images of the night. Indeed, this is a very famous strophe of Holderlin's. Even in his own lifetime, when this in particular, the opening strophe of this poem circulated widely, these images of the night, which is the shadow image, the shadowy image of the earth, Schattenbild, right? So the night, the moon is the shadow image of earth. It's die Schwärmerische, right? So the fantastical, or the zealot, right? The enthusiast. Um, uh, and and the night is the astonishing and the stranger to all that is human. If I had to characterize the movement between these 2 sections of the opening strophe, I might say something like it's a movement from realism to romance to romanticism, right? Where romanticism, we pass through the realism of the day, the bourgeois order of calculating the gains and the loss of commerce, into the romance of the evening, the music of strings, someone in love, recalling the days of his youth, thinking of distant friends. And finally, the romanticism of this inversion into the time of the night, right? The shadow image of the earth, which is the moon, and the stranger, the astonishing, the advent, right, of another world, of a shadow world of the night. As we move to the 2nd strophe, we can see that structure recapitulated to some extent, right? Aber, dividing after the first 6 lines, the 2nd unit, and the last unit, right? And again, we undergo key transitions here. In the first part of this strophe, see, Hamburger inserts the word night into the strophe where it is not. It should just say something like, wonderful is the favor of the exalted one, right? And no one knows where it comes from and what it will bring. It's more or less how I would translate these lines. So night works on the world and works on our souls, ever hoping, and we don't know what its purpose is. Um, for so God the highest has willed, right? God loves us so much that the day, the reasoning day, is dearer to us, right? I might Bezoninen, the one who I might translate that as something like circumspect day, the one who weighs those gains and losses. Um, um, Day is dearer to us, lieber, right, than the night, according to this opening section of the second strophe, because we don't know, we can't understand night. We don't know its purpose. Um, but then the movement into the second part of this strophe, nonetheless, there are times when clear eyes love shadows, clares auga. So there, the Aufklärung, right? The idea of the day as the time of reason, of calculation, of clarity and distinctness. Um, Even one who has clear eyes also loves the shadows. It's an interesting passage for thinking about the relationship between Enlightenment and Romanticism. It's not that Romanticism here is an anti-Enlightenment, but even those who have clear eyes also need or love shadows. It's a kind of argument, a justification of the night, which cannot be grasped, let's say, in the discourse of understanding, but requires a poetic rendering. Right? Even those who have clear eyes like to taste sleep uncompelled. They gaze into the night and enjoy it. And here's the justification. Yes, and rightly to her garlands we dedicate hymns, since to all those astray, the mad and the dead, she is sacred. Irrenden and Toten, right? So those who are dead and those who are mad, the night is sacred to them. So night is aligned with madness, with the dead. And we are right to dedicate hymns to it for this reason. It is sacred to unreason, and it is sacred to the dead. Um, and finally, the end of this strophe, but to us in her turn, so that in the wavering moment, deep in the dark, there shall be something at least that endures. Holy drunkenness she must grant, and frenzied oblivion. Grant the onrushing word, sleepless as lovers are too, and a wine cup more full, a life more intense and more daring, holy remembrance too, keeping us wakeful at night. So here, the onrushing word, stromende Wort, right? So the flowing word is aligned with the night, with holy drunkenness and frenzied oblivion, the bacchanalian, the Dionysian, as we'll come to see later in this poem. We can see that Hölderlin anticipates Nietzsche's distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian in these opening strophes, and indeed, Nietzsche may owe those distinctions to some extent to Hölderlin. He's a reader of Hölderlin. He would have read Bread and Wine. We can see very clearly this sort of polarization of the given, right, of the relationship between night and day. And the poet is the one who is sleepless as lovers are. The night grants the poet, or grants us, holy drunkenness and frenzied oblivion, and the flowing word, and holy remembrance as well, keeping us wakeful at night. So this is crucial. The Dionysian is that which is awake at night. So already we can see day is the time of waking, but the time of Bacchus, the time of the poem, is the wakefulness of night. This is crucial in relationship to the end of the poem. We go all the way to the end of strophe 9, right? Here it's sleep. The Titan is lulled to sleep in the arms of earth. And even Cerberus, the hellhound, who prevents anyone from leaving Hades, even he drinks and sleeps. Schlaft, it should be, not just lies down, but sleeps. Um, At the end of this poem, we arrive at a point of reconciliation. We can see this in the first line of the final strophe. Yes, and rightly they say, he reconciles day with night. I might translate that as, yeah, yes, rightly they say that he reconciles the day with the night. So at the end of the poem, we arrive at a point of reconciliation. At the beginning of the poem, we have a polarization of the rotation of the earth and degrees of light and darkness into day and night, mediated by evening. And here at the end of the poem, we have a reconciliation of the day with the night. And it's the wine god, right? Therefore, also the poets, this is the end of strophe 8, in earnest hymns, earnest songs to the wine god, never idly devise, sound that most ancient one's praise. So it's the wine god who reconciles day with our nighttime. And here's the end of the poem. Leads the stars of the day of the sky upward and down without end, always glad, like the living boughs of the evergreen pine tree which he loves, and the wreath wound out of ivory for choice, since it lasts, and conveys the trace of the gods now departed down to the godless below, in the midst of their gloom. What of the children of God was foretold in the songs of the ancients? Look, we are it, ourselves, fruit of Hesperia it is, of the West. Strictly it has come, fulfilled as in men by a marvel. Let those who have seen it believe. Much, however, occurs. Nothing succeeds because we are heartless, mere shadows until our Father Aether, made known, recognized, fathers us all. Meanwhile, though, to us shadows comes the Son of the Highest, comes the Syrian, and down into our gloom bears his torch. Blissful, the wise men see it, and in souls that were captive there gleams a smile, and their eyes shall yet thaw in response to the light. Dreams more gentle and sleep in the arms of earth lull the Titan. Even that envious one, Cerberus, drinks and sleeps. In the final stanza, we get a reconciliation of the day with the night, and we also get a powerful religious syncretism. The Son of the Highest comes to us from the shadows, or to us shadows, I'm sorry, we are shadows. To us shadows comes the Son of the Highest. So here we're in the world of the Christian Trinity, but also in the world of Dionysus as the son of Zeus, who Zeus, remember, obliterates Dionysus's mother, Semele, with a lightning bolt because she asks for Zeus to make himself manifest to her. The lightning bolt destroys her. This is in As on a Holiday. And Zeus takes the fetus of Dionysus and then brings it to term in his thigh, sews it into his thigh. So Dionysus is the twice born. And here Dionysus is therefore the Son of the Highest, as is Christ in the Christian Trinity. Both of them, as it were, come from the east. Comes the Syrian down into our gloom bearing his torch, like the sky, like the star in the sky that the wise men see. So here, Hölderlin achieves this kind of synthetic reconciliation of ancient polytheism and modern Christianity through a synthesis of Dionysus and Christ, again, a Nietzschean theme later on. And we see that this is achieved through the figure of bread and wine. So through the Eucharist. Bread is a fruit of the earth, yet touched by the blessing of sunlight. From the thundering God issues the gladness of wine. So the earth and the sky, the sunlight that brings the bread to fruition, and the darkness of the wine, of the night and of the sky. So the Christian Eucharist is fused with the cult of Dionysus. toward the end of this poem through the reconciliation of day and night. Let me just schematically say a few things about the structure of this poem, and then we'll go to a little bit of conversation. The poem we might think of as unfolding in three sections. So first of all, a kind of polarization, I would say, of the rotation of the earth, actually. I would put it in those terms, a polarization of day and night in the first two stanzas, first two strophes. Then from stanzas 3 to 6, a polarization of history and culture through the relationship of antiquity and modernity. The recollection of Greece, the traveling of the poetic spirit to Greece, to the Isthmus, the recollection of the happy land of the Greeks, and the sort of mourning and hope for the return of the gods, which is expressed in strophes 5 and 6. And the pathos of this questioning, right? Why are they silent too? The theater is ancient and hallowed. Why not now does this dance celebrate, consecrate joy? Where are they? Where thrive those famed ones, the festival's garlands? So the culture of ancient Greece has passed away from the earth. And this polarization of history is constructed from strophes 3 to 6, the opposition of the ancient and the modern. Then from strophes 7 to 9, we get passages on the vocation of the poet, and finally, this kind of synthetic reconciliation of the oppositions that have guided the poem between the day and the night, modernity and antiquity, or Christianity and polytheism. I think it's crucial then that in stanza 2, right, already forgetting in holy drunkenness, these are the gifts of the wine god, and these bring about the capacity to be awake at night. So the poem ends in sleep, but it also begins with the poet as the one who is wakeful at night, who is vigilant, who is sleepless as a lover, right? So it's not only possible to sleep during the day, as Cerberus does, but also to be awake at night. What I want to indicate here, what I would argue, is that at the core of this poem is not only first polarization and then synthesis, but also I would say a tension between polarization and synthesis, between separation and reconciliation. In my view, it's not only crucial that this poem ends in reconciliation, but that we also hold together that prospect of separation with the sort of, or reconciliation with the actuality of separation. So it's not just a movement from one to the other, but a tension between them, which I think is the pathos, the feeling of this poem. The feeling of this kind of torque and its historical problematic, the advent of this historical problem. The relationship between polarization and synthesis. At the end of strophe 3, which I'll bring up, we get a key figure of this tension, this kind of torque, which is crucial to the poem. Here we have the coming God, but we get this figure of sort of multi-directional rivenness. Thence has come, and back there points the God who's to come. So from the ancient world, from Greece, the God has come, and he points back to where he's come from. So this movement toward and backward is constitutive, I would say, of the pathos of modernity. I would translate that line as from there he comes and points backward, the coming God. From there he comes and points back, the coming God. So a movement toward and backward, which is experienced as advent, as that which comes. Something is still to come, is still ahead, is coming, but it also points backward to where it has come from. So this returns us to this question of time that was raised earlier in the seminar, the kind of rivenness of the relationship between history and time is one way I would put it, between the chronological linear movement of what came before and where we are now, but also the rivenness of time as a division between where we have come from, what we are pointing back to, and what remains to come. So the pathos of modernity in this poem, I would argue, is this feeling of a relationship between the possibility of reconciliation and the actuality of a polarized world. And this is correlated to a kind of torque of the relationship between time and history, the cyclical movement between day and night, but also the event or the advent of a possible reconciliation, which is to come, and which the work of the poem here is to bring about. Okay, that's all I have to say for now. Of course, we could talk about bread and wine for all 4 weeks, but we can take about 15 minutes now and take questions, discuss things about this poem. Again, next week we'll have more time to talk about it. Arnab says, isn't this recursive character of time also a reference to the messianic and the Nietzschean eternal return of the same? Well, I would say something more like, if we think of the relationship between Nietzsche's theory of the eternal return, that would possibly be a reference back to Hölderlin, or at least we could say Hölderlin anticipates or inscribes, first of all, this kind of way of thinking about the time of modernity in relationship to the time of the Greeks. Already we can see the opposition, the polarization of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And already we can see this relationship between Dionysus and Christ, which is how Nietzsche will call himself, Dionysus/Christ, in his later works. So I think a great deal of Nietzsche is anticipated and we could say poetized by Hölderlin. So that would be a key way of thinking about the relationship between poetry and philosophy. Yes, Frida. How do you pronounce your name? Can you?
Oh, it's Frida.
Frida? Okay, yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I was wondering if I'm like reading too much into it, but you know the way Kant used Schwärmerei?
Yes.
And, and the way Kant really moralizes, when
Yes.
he's talking about Schwärmerei, specific in Kritik der reinen Vernunft, I mean,
Yes.
he really used it as a super moralizing concept. So when Hölderlin is using it, I have the feeling that he's resisting, these moralizing and completely logistical kind of
Yes.
idea of Kant.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree. There's no, I think it's true that there's no way of anyone of Hölderlin's generation to encounter the term Schwärmerei or Schwärmer without thinking of Kant. So it's a normal German word. It's not a technical philosophical term. Kant is using the term to polemicize against those who would go beyond the boundaries of knowledge. We have to think within the conditions of possibility of any possible experience, which delimit the range of our possible knowledge of experience of the world, which is determined by the categorical constitution of our experience and its synthesis with intuition, with the givenness of sensations, etc. Okay. The Schwärmer is the one who goes beyond that, who wants to know the absolute, not only to think it as an ideal, but to determine it as a concept. And this is what Kant says we cannot do. When we go beyond the bounds of possible knowledge, reason throws up antinomies. This is Kant's theory of the relationship between reason and understanding, right? The bounds of understanding are the bounds of possible knowledge, and we have to remain within those. Otherwise, we're Schwärmers, right? We're enthusiasts, zealots who go beyond the proper bounds of reason. Spinoza, above all, would be the sort of icon of Schwärmerei for Kant. But now, after Kant, we're dealing with a generation of thinkers who want to remain within the broad framework of Kantian philosophy, who want to learn from it, but also think the absolute. Fichte, Schelling, Hölderlin, in a different way, Hegel. And so, yes, night, right, is the fantastical. Night is a kind of allegorical figure of Schwärmerei. Why? Because it cannot be known, but it is, in a way, the sort of advent of something like the absolute. Although here it's interesting that you have that figure of the fantastical, which is polarized with the day. So the rationality of the day, the pragmatism of weighing up, gains and losses, is opposed to the Schwärmerei of the night. And this is also a philosophical topos. And I think that in Hölderlin, yes, the poet is oriented toward the night, wants to reconcile it with the day, but also is open, right, to zealotry, to the fantastical, if we want, to the unconscious. For Schelling, the work of art is the confluence of conscious and unconscious activity. So it has to involve that dimension of the unknown and the unknowable. The absolute will be that fusion of conscious and unconscious activity. So this is one way in which I would say for Hölderlin, the poem becomes an organon of the absolute, of intellectual intuition, and the night is a key figure of the necessity of synthesizing that which is unknown with what is known. Absolutely. Yes, it's a substantive, it's a noun, the fantastical. Yes, it's wrong. It could be something like the enthusiast. I actually think fantastical is not that bad for the one who how does
Wouldn't it be the fantastic or the fantastical one? Right? It's not
yeah, I mean, but okay,
it's
yeah,
there's
the
a
one who
subject
is
there.
fantastical. Again, it's kind of
Yeah.
allegorical
Mhm.
term. Yeah, yeah.
But it's
Other,
another name for who's being addressed, I guess.
yeah, I agree. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Let's go with Jack first because he hasn't asked a question before, and then we'll come to you, Lynn. Yep.
Hi, I was just wondering if I get the sense that we're having like quite a positive feeling that this sort of new age of the night is like promising some kind of a new era in the world. But there's like much going on in this poem which suggests that the night is like a deeply lonely, depressing, perhaps like unpromising state of being of the world. We've been left behind by both the ancient, Greek gods and the Son of God and God. And that's sort of also the part of the character of the night. And I was wondering to what extent like that that can still retain a promise of something productive or good to come out of this moment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think again, this is a key tension in the figure of the night in this poem. So we are, in a sense, benighted, right? We are occluded. It is a desolate time. But in precisely that situation, Hölderlin thinks of the poets as priests of the wine god, who in holy night roamed from one place to the next. So the poets are errant, they're itinerant, they're homeless, they are at venture, right? And they are mediators between the world of the night, the world of drunkenness, of forgetfulness, and the world of the day. That's why they're wakeful at night. So I do agree that the crucial sort of messianic dimension of Hölderlin's poetry is that the coming God, in order to be redemptive or a reconciliation of day and night, has to pass through, has to undergo the desolate time of modernity. So the elements of loss and destitution that you're associating with night are certainly there. But at the same time, it's night in the second stanza who said, Hölderlin says, deep in the dark, there shall be something at least that endures. Holy drunkenness she must grant and frenzied oblivion, right? Grant the flowing word, etc., and wine cup more full. So all of that stems from the night. So I think it's precisely this movement from the sort of sufficiency of our identity with nature and with the gods, which for Schiller and Hölderlin, they at least associate with the time of the Greeks, even if that's obviously complicated. And the pathos of modernity is the endurance, the passing through, the suffering of a time where that sort of identity is lost. But there is a kind of something to be salvaged, as we'll see in Patmos, where I think the term retenda should be translated as salvage. We'll come back to that. Something is to be gained precisely through this experience of destitution. So it's exactly that dialectic, which is internal to the night on the one hand, and then enables it to be reconciled with the day. Think about the logic of that also. There's a difference or an opposition which is internal to the night itself. It's not only that the night is polarized with the day, but the night itself is a site of internal opposition, of difference, which it allows it to come into relation to that which it is different from, the day. So this kind of dialectical logic, I think, is both rigorous and associative in the movement of Hölderlin's poetry. Okay, Lynn and then Arnab. We have until 4:20, and then we'll address the syllabus.
I'd like to refer the article of Nancy, actually, a little bit. You mentioned this paradox between kind of synthesis and at the same time polarization. And well, actually, personally, I cherish Hölderlin much more for the fact that he evades, in fact, the idea of reconciliation. Well, in my view, of course. And I was actually very curious while reading this text of Nancy about the way he differentiates between philosophy and poetry in the case of Hölderlin, that he doesn't construct, but try to concentrate and gaze at a point as precisely as he can, but at the same time that this point is the whole, but the whole which we do not understand, but which we can see or sense. And I think he also refers to it as a synopsis instead of synthesis. So I was wondering if you could comment on it a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, those are important distinctions. I mean, Nancy's piece, I like the piece very much. It's particularly interesting in relationship to Bread and Wine because here this poem begins with a sort of the world of calculation, right? Weighing up in their heads, pensive, the gain and the lost. So buying and selling, making money, weighing up what has been gained and what has been lost, the kind of pragmatism of the world of calculation, which we might think of as distinctively bourgeois in modernity. Nancy has another kind of calculation in mind, which, as you say, is this kind of taking aim at the singular point. So this is crucial, that there's a singular sort of genesis of the poem, which has to do with the taking aim at a point of singularity. That the poem, as it were, stems from something like a singularity, and that the poet is the one who has to calculate how to bring that about through, let's say, the formal constitution of the poem. In Hölderlin's poetological writings, if you read them for this week, we can come back to them. They're too complicated to get into right now. But we have this constant worrying about, everything that's the ground of the poem, which the poet takes in the register of sort of receptivity, and then which can be lost in the constitution of the poem, in the form of the poem, because the poem has to pass through difference, right? It has to move through differential moods and themes and movements and materials. And that is to say, the absolute threatens to be lost in that movement of difference. So somehow the poem itself has to hold together that singularity of that which it takes aim at with the internal difference of its form and its thematic movements. This is the problem, I would say, of poetic composition for Hölderlin. And all of that relies on feeling. He says over and over again, right? There has to be, so the poet has to kind of sustain this singular feeling. We could look at the last lines of strophe 5 very quickly to sort of draw this out, where, it's right, we're thinking of man has been given everything by the gods, but loses it. Such as man, when the wealth is there, and no less than a god in person tends him with gifts, blind he remains, unaware, right? He cannot see it and know it. First he must suffer, tragen muss er. So first he must bear it, right? So that's a figure of pathos, that which has to be undergone, that which we must bear. Now he names that which is dearest to him, that which he loves the most, his most treasured possession, sein Liebstes. And now, for it, words like flowers leaping alive, he must find. I might translate that as, you know, now words for it must grow, must emerge like flowers, must be entstehen, right? Must be posited almost, but must be, they must grow up like flowers. So this is, one has to bear something, the tragedy of not knowing what one has until it's lost. And then in that very sight, that's what I think is interesting here. Now, words for it, for the place where it is, as it were, what he loves the most, will grow up like flowers. This is the genesis of the poem. Okay, one more question or comment. Arnab.
Professor, first I apologize for my camera being off because
it's okay.
Actually, it's the Zoom software doesn't align with my driver, my camera drivers.
Okay.
So sorry about that. But I had a couple of questions. The first one is about how the image of the Eucharist in bread and wine is synthesized with the figure of Dionysius. I was thinking this kind of syncretism, does it also refer to the Spinozist pantheism? Because in the image of the Eucharist, we have an anthropological predecessor of the sacrifice of the bull in ancient pagan fertility cults, where the bull was sacrificed and it was feasted upon. So does it also refer to this kind of pantheism where one partakes of the blood and body of the god, or the bull, aka Christ?
It's a great question. I mean, I think certainly we can see here, it's a tremendously heretical passage, by Christian standards, that we have in strophe 8 of this poem, where we have bread is fruit of the earth, right? So that does not say bread is the body of Christ, right? And it does not say wine is the blood of Christ. It says bread is a fruit of the earth, yet touched by the blessing of sunlight. So here, bread is immanent to the earthly, right? It is fruit of the earth, touched by the blessing of sunlight. So it's a reconciliation here, at least a relationship between what is underground and what is touched by the sun. And then from the thundering God issues the gladness of wine. So here we have the thundering God being something like Zeus, and Dionysus coming from the thundering God. These polytheistic references are linked with the Christian Trinity, are linked with the Eucharist, and we might indeed see that they're also to some extent naturalized. Bread is a fruit of the earth. So if one wants to think of that in a pantheistic way, as emerging from a kind of Spinozist identity of God and nature, I think to some degree that would be valid, but it's also belief in the gods, in a kind of polytheistic pantheism, is not Spinozist, right? So from every angle, this is a heretical system. It's not Greek polytheism. It's not modern Christianity, and it's not quite pantheism either. It's a sort of synopsis might be a good way of thinking about it rather than synthesis. It's a holding together of these discrepant elements in the singularity of their difference. And it's the poem that constructs the space where those can come together. So in that sense, the difference of the poet from the theologian, right, or from the minister, is that again, the poet is not constrained by doctrine, right? The poem can imminently construct the world in which these oppositions can be held together. I have now to move on to quickly some remarks about the assignments for the certificate students and the structure of the syllabus. Let me put that up if I have it here. Hold on one second. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so for those of you who are certificate students, again, the syllabus has all the readings for the class. Again, we're going to be focusing on these primary texts, but you can be informed by the other readings, and they can come up as they have a little bit today. Again, I urge everybody to get a physical copy of Michael Hamburger's translation of Holderlin, which is available as an inexpensive Penguin edition. You also have the ebook if you need it. All of these PDFs are on our Google page. But then let's look at the grading and assignments for certificate students. Okay, so attendance is 20% of the grade. This is the normal setup of the new center. In-class participation is 10%. As we see, we've had discussion, and we'll have much more time for discussion in subsequent sessions. And then, rather than seminar presentations by students, what we're going to do is have each certificate student can write one discussion post, just a brief discussion post of 250 to 500 words, which can focus on either a primary text or a secondary text. And just articulate an idea, a question, or a problem. You can take these discussion posts up from any angle that you want, something that you notice, something that you're interested in, let us know what it is. And then these are things which you'll have at hand, which we could then address in discussion during the seminars. So again, usually the last hour of the seminar will be devoted to open discussion. And then finally, you'll write a final essay of 8 to 10 pages, or you can do a 15 to 20-minute video presentation on the topic of your choosing. If you have questions about that, I'm available to answer questions in the Google Classroom. So you can post a comment or a question, and I'll get back to you. Does anyone have any questions about the syllabus or the structure of these assignments? It's pretty simple. Yes, Caleb.
Yeah, regarding the discussion posts, is there like a time frame after class that
Yeah,
is
so
submitted,
so
or how would
that I meant to mention. Yeah, so by tomorrow, I will post on the Google Classroom page. I'll designate which of the 3 weeks everybody will be posting on. So what I'll do is I'll divide the group up into 3, and I'll specify people who will be posting next week, and then in week 3, and then in week 4. And that will just be in alphabetical order. And then if there's some reason why you really can't post one week and you really want to post another one, or there's some topic that you specifically want to address in your discussion post, let me know and I'll be flexible about that. But initially, the way I'll divvy it up so that we have some balance is I'll put up that list, and each person will be assigned week 2, week 3, or week 4. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? Carlos, do you have a question about assignments, or is that hand still up from bread and wine?
Yeah, it's not more in regards to the seminar, but we can just hold on if
Yeah,
anyone else.
we can come to that in a moment.
Exactly.
Anyone else about the structure of the seminar or the assignments? Okay, well, you can get in touch with me. again, really appreciate you being here. And I hope you'll come back. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
And Carlos, we can address your question if you want.
Sure.